everyone, let's get started. So I'm going to start off by creating a new project and I'm going to click on empty views activity. And in here, I'm just going to call this daily dad jokes. So something simple. And I'm just going to keep the rest of the options the same. And I'm going to click on finish. And we're just going to wait until this boots up and gets all set up. All right, so once that's all set up, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste in, just like the basic duck that I have. So, and I'm going to put it into my drawables folder, and here you have it. So let's work a little bit on our activity main XML. I'm just going to switch to the split side and actually just minimize this a little bit here. I already have the layout prepared. I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I'm just going to copy and paste it in. Also, feel free to grab it from my GitHub page. But let me explain a little bit about what I have here. So this is my little duck that I just pasted in and had showed you in a second before. We've got our simple title here. We've got the image of a duck. We have this little placeholder for where our quote is going to be. And as you can see, I've given it a specific ID and I call it quote text. So you need an ID because we're actually going to grab this text view later on. For this dad here, I've given it the ID of author text. And I've got a little button whose ID is refresh button. So every single time we click on this button, it'll give us a new quote. But this is basically just the starting layout. And this section here gets replaced by our quote every single time we click on this button. So this is just a simple layout of it. I want to introduce you guys to what kind of API we're going to be using, and that is the I can has dadjoke.com. So if you simply go onto this website here and just click on refresh, you'll see that it gives you a random dad joke to work with. So you can keep on refreshing the page and get new dad jokes. Who want to use this API, they actually have an API section over here, and they give you instructions on how to call the API and use it. So what they'll need is something called like an accept header. So we'll need to pass in what kind of response we want to get back from the website. So in our case, we want to get back a JSON response. And we also need to set the custom user agent, which I'll show you how to do in our Kotlin code. The way that we are able to get this random dad joke is by using this get method and then calling the website, fetch a random dad joke. And what we get back from this website is this JSON response. So there are three sections to this JSON response. The first thing we have is an ID, and you can see it's also a string. We have a joke, and it is also a string. Last thing we have here is the status, and the status number is simply like an integer. So for this, we're actually going to be creating three files. One of them is the data class, which we're going to start off with. So if I head on over to project, click on Kotlin Java, and then do a right click on this project file, click on new, click on Kotlin class, and click on data class here. That's what we're going to be setting it to. And for this class, I'll just call it a dad joke and click on enter. So you've already seen that coming from the API has three parts to it. It's got the ID, the joke, and the status. We're going to need to define exactly those three things inside of this data class. So in here, I'm going to write ID and keep it as string. And then the second thing is our joke, and then also keep it as a string. And for the last one, status, I'm going to keep it as an integer. So you want to make sure that you are matching this um, like to the same names that your API has. So this is our data class, and essentially when our quote comes in from the API, it'll be in this specific dad joke form. Do is we're going to create the service. So the service is sort of like what kind of requests can you make to the API? So for the service, what we're going to do is we're going to do a right click, click on new, click on Kotlin class, and this is going to be the interface type. And let's just call this the dad joke service. And so this basically sets up what requests are we expecting our API to get. And for that, what we're going to do is we're going to be working with the retrofit class. So for the retrofit class, you actually need to head on over to Gradle scripts first, click on this one over here, and down in your dependencies, there are two lines you need to paste. So you don't have to type this up yourself. You can simply just copy and paste it. So right underneath here, I'm going to paste it in. You can also just grab it from my GitHub. Paste them in, you'll see that this option for sync now pops up. So you all you have to do is just click on it and let it sync. When you have this pasted in, um, what you want to do next is you actually want to navigate to your manifest folder and click on Android manifest. And so these are just basically like the rules that are set up for your Android app. And because we are using a website on the internet, the icanhasdadjoke.com, we're actually going to need to paste this line in that lets your app have permission to use the internet. So if you don't have this in, you'll notice that your app just crashes and doesn't work. It won't tell you why, but then you'll eventually realize is that you need this line in. So just be sure that you paste that in. We're going to go back to our dad joke service here. And inside of here, I'm going to paste these lines in. So we're going to need get headers and call because we're going to be using them. But inside of this dad joke interface, we're going to define some headers. And like I mentioned to you guys before, we need to define what kind of accept we're looking. So we're actually looking to grab your API response as a JSON. So we just need to define this in. The next thing is user agent. So user agent kind of like lets the API know where it's coming from. So you can really write this in as anything you want. Let's just call it daily dad joke. So this is what they're going to be seeing in terms of like who's using the API. And the next thing I'm going to define here is our get call. So if you look back at our dad joke, we're essentially just grabbing the main website. There really isn't like an ending after this hashtag. So because of that, we're also just going to be using sorry, a slash over here, not a hashtag. So for our get, um, we're getting it from the main page. And in here, I'm actually going to define this as a function and call it get random quote. And what I'm getting it in as is as a dad joke. And yeah, that basically sets up what we're looking for in terms of requests and what we want, what kind of requests are we making to the API. So we've got our header set up, and then we have our get method. So the next thing we'll need is our client. So our client, like if you think of the service as sort of like the menu in terms of what kind of data you want, is our dad joke, method are you using, which is our get, and what kind of headers you want to send out. So think of this as the menu, and your client would be your delivery guy. So we're actually going to create the client next, and we're also going to create it as a Kotlin file. So I'm going to right click on here, click on new, click on Kotlin, and it's going to be a object. So I'm going to call this our dad joke client and then click on enter. So think of your client as a way to set up your connection to the API. It builds everything and it actually ends up delivering the request to the API. Is an instance. So because this is an object, it's more like a one-time object that we create. From here, what we're going to be setting this instance as is as our dad joke service. And we're going to be writing it in as lazy. So by lazy means that don't build it unless we need it. So the first time that we need this instance is when you need to start building it. So inside of here, what we're going to be using is our retrofit library, and we're going to be using the builder method. That's up the retrofit setup process. And inside here, we're going to be using base URL. So if you see this come up and if you just hover over it, you'll see this import class. So just click on that and it'll import it for you. Now for your base URL, you're gonna go straight to your icanhas.joke. And if you go back to the main website, this is what you're gonna be copying right here from the home page. So when you go back to your URL, you'll paste this in. And then the next thing we're going to add is our add converter factory. Here, the JSON converter factory, and then dot create. So if you see this, just hover over it and it will say import class. And so this is the one that you're importing. If it doesn't really work for you, then just copy and paste this line in. So that basically just converts your JSON to your Kotlin objects. And next thing we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, now you can finish building it, but make sure you create it as your dad joke service. And you want to define this in as your class.java. And that basically sets it up for you as your dad joke client. So again, the client is simply a way for you to call your API. So you're going to call it straight from the base URL. You're going to make sure that whatever JSON comes in, you convert it to your Kotlin objects, you build it, and you create it as your dad joke service. Head on over to your main activity. And let's just take a quick look at what our layout looks like. And remember that we have certain IDs associated to each of the views. So if you click on this view here, this one is associated to the ID quote text. This one is associated to author text. And then this one is for the refresh button. And we're going to be changing these two here. So sometimes the author might change depending on whether like we're offline or online. The quote will obviously change. And then for our button here, we need to make sure that we're adding a set on click listener so that we know whenever the button's being pressed so we can give another quote in. So for that, we're going to be creating three variables. So I'm gonna give one for quote text, and it is a text view type. So I'm gonna write text view and put that in. And then I'm gonna do the same thing for our author text and also just make sure that it is a text view. Create one for our button. So I'm just gonna call it button and make sure it is our button type. So then we have these three variables set up. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to assign each of these variables. So I'm going to call find view by ID. In here, write r.id.quote text. So this is for our quote text. And remember, this is the ID associated to that text view. Same thing for author text. I'm going to write find view by ID. So this basically just grabs that view using its ID, and then the same thing for our button, find view by ID, r.id.refresh button. Okay, so now that we have these three things set up, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a function. So this is going to be a private function inside of main activity. And so basically this is where onCreate ends. And after onCreate here, I'm going to write private fun. And I'm going to call this function fetch dad quote. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to call on our dad joke client. And I'm going to be using the instance from dad joke client and using the get random quote function because in this function, I want to fetch our dad joke. And um, the way that it works is I'm actually going to use an onQueue method. And what I'm on queuing or what I'm queuing up is uh, our dad jokes. I'm going to use callback. And in here, I'm going to pass in the dad joke, get a random quote from the API. When you get it, make sure you queue it up because you don't really want to overload your Android with all these requests for your dad joke. So it's only when it comes in do you actually want to start using this dad joke. So when your dad joke comes in, from the API, we have two different options. What happens if we do get a response back, and what happens when we don't get a response back from the API? So we have on failure. So we're actually going to first work with the on response method. So I'm just going to, if it comes up, just click on it, comment this in. So the first case is what happens if we do get a response back. So if our response is successful and the response body, so the actual body of the response, is not null. So this means that we actually have a quote. The API comes in successfully, and the quote itself is there. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a value call and call it quote. And in here, we're going to assign it response body. And I'm going to put these two exclamation marks at the end. This is actually required because your Android Studio will give you an error if you don't add this in. This basically means like, hey, I trust that this response body is not null, so just make sure you can use it. And once we get the quote back, we're actually going to assign it to quote text, right? So we're going to change the text over here, this here, and we're going to change the attribute text. So we're going to change it from lorem ipsum, and we're going to assign quote text dot text. We're going to change this attribute. And I'm actually going to start by putting in these quotation marks. So we'll need four here. And I'm going to grab this and I'm going to extract quote dot joke. Okay, so we're extracting the joke part of the API. And the reason why I've added these extra quotation marks in is because I actually want my text to be displayed in with quotation marks. So that's why I had to add these extra slashes in. Okay. And for the author, so who the author text is, I can also change this attribute to say it's dad. And if it's not successful, or let's say that we are connected to the API, but if for some reason it's not coming in or like it's corrupted, then what you can do is you can take the text and you can actually give them a little message like, dad has no more jokes left to give. And you can play around with this however you like, but for the author text, I'll just say that we have missing an action, dad, and then just throw in a sad face in there. So that basically sets up our on response. The next one we're going to create is for our on failure. So what happens if we cannot connect to our API? So on failure, let's implement this. What we can throw in here is we can take our quote text and we can just say that dad is offline, that face. And then for our author text, I guess we don't really need anything. So we can just leave it empty. So if you just put in your empty quotation marks, it really won't show. All right, so that basically sets up our function fetch dad quote. And basically, when you open up your app, you want it to fetch your dad quote for you. But you also want to make sure that every single time you click on your button that it also fetches that dad quote. So in here, I'm going to click on set on click listener and write in here, fetch dad quote. And that is pretty much all we need. So I guess the next thing we could do is just make sure. Okay, so this is our app and let it load. Okay, and then you can see we have our dad jokes coming in. Cool. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. You can also connect it through an actual physical device and let it play. But that pretty much sums it up for this video. Thank you guys for watching and stay tuned for the next couple of videos, which will be coming out soon. All right, bye everyone. Take care.